Water is an essential part of growing vegetables or any other type of growing or gardening, and generally the more you grow, the more water is needed, up to a point of course. Many places around the world don't get enough rain during the growing season and require irrigation in order to grow abundant crops, or we need to accept a lower yield of more drought-tolerant plants. In the maritime climate of Ireland, we generally get enough rain to maintain sufficient soil moisture for plants during most of the growing season for most years, though we can get problematic dry periods. Generally, we get more rain than is needed, especially during the winter, and with all the flooding that's going on around here, it's appropriate to ask how much rain is too much. Like so many other things, the answer to this question depends on context. And it's not just about how much it rains over how long of a period of time, but also when it rains and how quickly the water moves away. Here in the Midlands of Ireland, we would typically get a total of just under 1 metre, or a bit more than 36 inches of rain each year, and that is fairly evenly spread throughout the year. We tend to get a bit more rain in the winter and less in the summer, but on average August can be surprisingly wet, and February can be quite a bit drier. Of course, there can be huge variations from one season to the next, with unusually dry periods causing problems with growth in the summer when a lot more water is needed. And really wet periods generally happening in the winter, and that is when the water can be most problematic, especially with flooding. A big factor here is that there's very little evaporation from the surface of the soil in the winter, and almost no water is being pulled up from deeper in the soil by the vegetation. So without any significant evapotranspiration during the winter, the water can only soak away or flow downhill, and this can take a while and cause a lot of trouble downstream. So far this month, we've had more than twice the amount of rain that we would expect in a typical February, and judging from the forecast for next week, it will probably end up being the wettest month in the last 4 years. Thankfully, it was fairly dry for the last 2 weeks of January, and the previous few months were not excessively wet, so there was still capacity in the soil to absorb some of this excess rainfall. The impact of this rain really depends on the specifics of the site, how quickly the rainfall can be absorbed by the soil, and whether water flows onto the site from somewhere else. The Red Gardens are located on a slight hill, with very little land further uphill. So if there is any surface water, it would tend to flow away from the gardens rather than towards them. This is quite a bit different than a fair amount of the farmland around here, especially those that are situated in low-lying areas that tend to receive floodwaters from upstream, and to make matters worse, typically would have soil that can't absorb water very quickly. The soil on this little hill is quite sandy, and it would take a lot of rain over a very short period of time for there to be any significant water visible on the surface of the ground. But we tend to get rain over longer periods of time rather than the really heavy downpours typical of other climates, so this is rarely an issue. And based on the exploration holes that I have dug in the past, the subsoil also appears to be quite free draining, at least for as deep as I've been able to dig. It still takes a while for the excess water in the soil to drain away, but I have found that I can get into the gardens after waiting a few days without making too much of a mess or heavily damaging the structure of the soil. This really helps when trying to grow vegetables year-round, and is a definite benefit of this specific site. Really heavy rain does affect the surface of any exposed soil, breaking down the texture or clumps of soil into smaller particles. In really bad cases, this can reduce the infiltration of water into the soil, but I haven't found it to be much of an issue. Only the surface of the soil is damaged, and there's enough sand involved to maintain the ability of the water to filter into the soil. And it seems the well-managed soil with higher amounts of organic matter does even better. The leaves of overwintering plants offer some protection, and a full covering of green manure definitely helps to protect the soil surface. I've also noticed that the crop cover and mesh that I use to protect overwintering plants from the wind and pests also shields the soil from damaging rainfall. And I've found that ground cover fabric is the best method for protecting seed beds that are waiting for an early season sowing, as the texture of the surface of the soil remains really good even over a full winter, assuming that the high winds don't blow the fabric around. The paths in the gardens do tend to get compacted if I walk on them too much in the winter. The process of repeatedly stepping on the paths breaks down the structure of the soil's texture and can create an impenetrable surface, which means the water can't drain away, which makes things even worse. The same thing can happen in the high traffic areas of grass that surround the gardens and in the overall site, especially in front of the Polytunnel entrance and on the path towards the composting area. This creates a real mess, even without using tractors or machinery, but a heavy wheelbarrow can cause some significant damage. Spreading straw over areas that are prone to damage helps to reduce the impact, and wood chip is even better, but this is a big area to cover. I generally try to stay away from the gardens entirely during wet weather, but this has significantly delayed things in the past and left a lot more work during the busier times later in the spring. I'm really glad that we did have a few weeks of much drier weather in January this year, as we were able to get a lot of the gardens cleared up and many of the beds prepared for planting. Now that the soil is saturated with water, I'd prefer to wait for at least a few days without any rain before I go into the gardens to do any work. But if I do need to go into the gardens for harvesting or some other reason, I'm not likely to do excessive amounts of damage, so long as I don't walk on the beds and leave the soil alone as much as possible. So, while the specifics of the site and the soil type that I work with in these gardens can handle a lot of rain without too much damage, so long as I stay away, all of this rain probably creates issues with soil fertility. Any water that does drain through the soil takes with it traces of soil nutrients that it picks up along the way, potentially moving this soil fertility out of reach of the plant roots. How much this happens depends on a lot of different factors, including the proportion of clay particles that there are in the soil. But the difference between the rainfall and evapotranspiration rates is a significant issue around here. The potential evapotranspiration rate is a calculation of the amount of water that is likely evaporated from the surface of the soil, added to what is pulled out of the soil by the plant roots and incorporated into the plant itself, or more commonly transpired into the atmosphere. Both of these increase with the heat and summer growing season and reduce in the winter. Ideally, the amount of rainfall that we get would roughly match the amount of evapotranspiration from the garden soil each season, but that is rarely the case. Whenever the evapotranspiration rate is higher than the rainfall, the garden is at risk of drying out once the soil moisture starts to be used up. But I can irrigate the gardens to make up for this. Whenever the amount of rainfall exceeds a combination of evaporation and transpiration, this increases the likelihood that some of the soil fertility will wash away, and this can be a difficult issue to address. Looking at the typical monthly rainfall and the potential evapotranspiration rates supplied by the National Weather Service, some summers have less rainfall than what is used by plants or evaporated. The winter shows another situation entirely, with lots of water flushing down through the soil every winter, potentially taking fertility with it, as it has done for thousands of years. This is a huge loss of fertility over long periods of time, but I'm not sure how much this annual loss would compare to the amount of fertility that I add to the gardens each season, the rate that the soil biology can extract new nutrients from the rocks, or the amount of nutrients that are removed from the soil through the harvest of vegetables. In addition, some types of soil nutrients are more likely to wash away than others, and this can lead to imbalances in soil fertility. I think that this is not such a big issue in a small-scale garden, as it's easier to add lots of fertility, but it is something that I need to take into consideration. And if I'm aware of any fertility imbalances, either by testing the soil or some other method, I can more easily correct them. But with field-scale agriculture, this can be really difficult and expensive. Adding good quality compost helps, not just by adding more fertility to the soil, but also by helping to increase the amount of fertility and water that the soil can hold. Green manures can also really help, as they draw some of the fertility out of the soil before the winter and incorporate it into the plant tissue. But I don't think that they can hold on to all of the fertility that was in the soil, and there is always going to be some nutrients that can be washed away. Overall, this is quite a good site for vegetable gardens, as there really isn't any risk of soil erosion or flooding. And I've done a lot of things to protect the soil with more that I can do in the future, and I tend to add lots of fertility to the gardens, and I have been taking soil tests so that I'm not so worried about the impact of any loss of fertility. If I make sure that I do most of the bed preparations prior to the wet season, I can avoid needing to go into the gardens except to harvest the overwintering crops. So in this context, these vegetable gardens can handle quite a bit of rain, assuming that this rainy weather stops at some point in the near future so that I can get into the gardens and start growing vegetables again. But this wet weather has been really demoralizing, especially as it's come with high winds and cool temperatures. It's felt relentless for weeks, and it looks like the next week is going to be more of the same. I'm really glad to have polytunnels to work and grow in during this type of wet winter weather, but I still need to get into and out of these protected microclimates, and that has been making a real mess of the paths. While I am glad I prioritized the work in the outside gardens during the drier weather earlier in the year, this past week I've been moving a lot of compost into the 2 polytunnels to prepare the beds for spring plantings, and it's been a real mess. especially as the high winds blew off some of the plastic covering the compost piles, and moving soaking wet compost is not much fun. So, while the gardens may be able to handle this wet weather, and it's still quite early in the season, I've had enough, and I'm really looking forward to this rainy weather stopping.